continuing our pandemic series of great lectures on archaeological sites in the Americas. Today I have Dr. Scott Hammerstedt, who is a senior researcher with the Oklahoma Archeological Survey. Scott, what does that job entail?
Basically, my job is to conduct archaeological research in the state of Oklahoma. My specialty is Mississippian societies and archaeological geophysics. So that's what I spend most of my time doing.
Please get us started.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. Today, we're going to be talking about the Spiro Mounds located in eastern Oklahoma. This is a view of sort of the main mound at the site. Spiro is continued to be considered to be part of the Mississippian culture, which dates between about AD 1000 and AD 1500 or so in the southeastern United States. Spiro, you can see it circled in red here, is an offshoot called Caddoan Mississippian. Basically, it's parts of Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and Louisiana. Here's where it's located along the Arkansas River, just a little bit to the west of Fort Smith, Arkansas. You can see the location of the park circled in red there, with the river right next to it. First thing I want to talk about is basically the types of mounds that exist at Spiro, and then I'll get into some more of the details of the history of the site and some of the current research that's been going on there. The Spiro is most known for the Craig Mound, which is here on the top right, which is a conjoined burial mound. You can sort of see the lobes of it right here. That's what we know. Most of what we know about Spiro comes from the largest cone of this mound. We'll talk about that again in a minute. But there are also some platform mounds here. This is the one on the bottom left is called the Brown Mound. Small little platform, flat top, sloped sides, had some buildings inside of it. And the last type of mound we have are house mounds. And this is really hard to see in this photograph, but you can sort of see a little hump right here. This one's only about maybe a meter tall, not even quite that. Whereas the large cone on the Craig Mound is about 10 meters tall, excuse me, and this one's more like 3 or 4. Here's an idea of the layout of the site. The Craig Mound, the conjoined mound, is right here. The ward mounds are 2 burial mounds. We've got a series of house mounds coming around here, and 2 platform mounds, Koppel and Brown. Brown is the one I just showed you the photo of a second ago. And on the left, you can see this sequence basically going to about 900 or so, going in, and Spiro is abandoned somewhere around 1400. And then other people with more plains adaptations move in a little bit later. That's what the Fort Coffee phase is. Most of what I'm going to be talking about today probably has to do with this Spiro period around 1400. So this is what the Craig Mound looks like today. It's a little bit easier to see in this photograph than the one I had before. I got this photograph about 6 years ago when it was freshly cleared off. It has been rebuilt. Don Wyckoff from the Oklahoma Archeological Survey did some excavations there in the late 60s to figure out the footprint of the mound, because when it was completely leveled in the 1930s. And it was based upon this famous photograph taken by Joseph Thoburn from the Oklahoma Historical Society in 1914. So you can see the lobes. Go back a slide and you can sort of see the very similar pattern to it. Very famous photograph. So Spiro has an interesting history. Thoburn, when he took this photograph, did a little bit of excavation in the ward mounds, found some burials, things like that. The next real period of work, quote unquote work at Spiro, was done in the 1930s when the site was heavily looted. There was a group of locals calling themselves the Pocola Mining Company who had arranged to get a lease to dig into the mounds looking for basically what they thought would be treasure. This is during the Great Depression when a lot of people were out of work. And so this is the way they were going to try to find artifacts and make some money out of it. So they obtained a lease and were digging in the Craig Mound and in the Brown Mound. I'll show some pictures of that in a minute. And finding lots of interesting artifacts. Artifact dealers were coming out to the site and buying things right on the site, right directly from the Pocola folks. Eventually, there's a professor at OU called Forrest Clements, who is a biological anthropologist and the head of the Department of Anthropology. He got wind of this, went out and checked it out, tried to shut them down. They didn't want to be shut down. He eventually was able to get a law passed that said in order to dig a site in Oklahoma, you had to have a permit signed by the head of the anthropology department at OU, so Forrest Clements. And that, as a result of that law, when their lease ran out, they were forced to abandon the site. And a lot of the really neat artifacts we know about from Spiro come from that work. So here's a look of what much of Craig looked like after the looting. You can sort of see their quote unquote excavations there. Not very controlled. They dug a tunnel into the main lobe of Craig Mound, the largest one. You can see a photograph of it here and a little bit on the outside. This led to a hollow chamber within the mound with a lot of fancy artifacts we know about that I will come back to in a couple of minutes. Eventually, this mound was, this tunnel was dynamited by local farmers. There's some accounts where the looters supposedly did it in retaliation to Clement, but actually it was left open and the locals dynamited it because they were worried about their kids playing in there and having it collapse. This is what the second and third cones of Craig looked like when the Pocola folks were finished. You can see it's basically cratered. And these are some of the artifacts that were found: the famous resting warrior pipe, ceremonial spuds, engraved shell cups, lots of beads. This is a photograph that appeared in the Kansas City Star with the headline of King Tut's, America's King Tut's tomb looted, or something to that effect. Here's some of the ear spools that were found. Most of these were stone. Some of them had copper embossing on it with engravings and decorations in them. The famous Spiro Mound lace. This is at the Sam Noble Museum at OU right now. It's a very thin piece of textile, very great preserve. The way the hollow chamber was sealed up, a lot of fancy artifacts like baskets and textiles and that lace preserved when normally they might not have. I don't have a good photograph of the one at the bottom, but that's actually, there's actually reds and yellows and things dyed onto that. They also trenched into the Brown Mound. They actually drove a mule team right through the middle of it and carved it out pretty good. They didn't really get a whole lot out of this. Brown Mound had some fancy artifacts in it, but nothing to the extent that Craig did. So after Clements got these guys kicked off the site, crews under the supervision of the Works Progress Administration or Projects Administration, depending on what year you're talking about, were the next ones to dig at Spiro. Basically, here are the four main supervisors here: David Barris, Ken Orr, Phil Newcommit, and Lynn Howard. These were all basically had some training, maybe just for a couple of sites, a couple of weeks at a site, and then were put in charge of their own projects if they were sort of deemed worthy. So Barris and Orr and Howard had decently long careers in archaeology. Phil Newcommit was a surveyor by training, but came in and did a lot of the mapping and supervised a lot of the sites. Eventually worked in the petroleum industry later on, and I'd like to thank his granddaughter Tracy Newcommit Burroughs for giving me this photograph. It's one of my favorites. It's kind of like the archaeological rat pack. But the WPA was tasked with basically excavating what was left of the Craig Mound and trying to salvage some usable data out of it. So what they did was they dug in strips that are about 5 feet wide, and they exposed large profiles, as you can see here. One of the things you can see in this photograph is a cedar pole right here that formed part of the hollow chamber. They worked in this method for quite some time until they were working at another mound nearby Spiro called the Schedule Mound. That mound was riddled enough with looter tunnels that one of these profiles stumbled across one and it collapsed and killed one of the workers. After that, they worked more on a sort of a horizontal approach to it. Here's another example. It's one of those upright cedar poles that form the walls of the chamber, and part of a cedar litter burial right here. And you can sort of see the part of the tunnel and how tall this mound actually is based upon the size of this worker here. One of the things they were tasked with was by the landowners, when the WPA was finished, they wanted the mound to be completely flattened out, as I alluded to earlier. This is why Don Wyckoff did the excavations to try to figure out the footprint. But they hired a local farmer named Evans, and this is Mr. Evans and his mule team. And his job was basically to drag the dirt around and spread it out. If you read the WPA's correspondence, they had a lot of trouble with Evans because he would routinely go off on a bender and not show up for a while, or show up drunk and all sorts of things like that. I recently wrote a book that was on the history of WPA work in some of these sites in eastern Oklahoma. So there's a shameless plug for you. So the WPA eventually dug pretty much all of Craig Mound, all of the Ward mounds, tested pretty much all the other mounds at the site. But they also worked in a couple of non-mound areas and located a couple of houses. And I put some photographs of those up in here. And you can see there's the posts here. They're relatively straight walled, fairly uniform. Most of them have central support posts here and have some artifacts in here. On the bottom left, you can see a sort of an artist reconstruction. Some of these have this long extended entranceway, which probably served as a special purpose building. But you can see the posts on the inside, pitched roof, and then the walls. So these are going to be important later on for how regularly shaped these buildings are. So file that away for a few minutes. After the WPA finished, Spiro pretty much sat undisturbed by archaeology for the next 30 or 40 years. I left off Don Wyckoff's work to locate the mound in the 60s, but there's Don right there. In 1979 and 1980 through 1981 or so were the next round of excavations and publishing from the survey, mostly directed by Dan Rogers, who's just recently retired from the Smithsonian. They focused initially on house mounds, but also did a little bit of work directed to the nature of what the plaza might be, and located a couple other special purpose buildings with extended entranceways, especially in what's called House Mound 5. And then that's the last work that's happened since we started working there about 8 or 9 years ago. So that's sort of the history of work at the site. What I want to talk about now are some of the features of it. We're mostly going to focus on the Craig Mound in this discussion. And this image is taken from a website, but it's also in a book by Larry and Chris Merriam. This is called the Spiro Mound, a photo essay or something close to that. But what it shows is the larger cone here, and then the smaller cones here. The squiggles are basically with the locations of burial clusters. What we're going to focus on the most is what's called the Great Mortuary and the Central Chamber right in here. And you can see some of those cedar poles that I mentioned earlier right there. So a close-up of it, and this is all based on some work that Jim Brown, who's retired from Northwestern University, has been working with. This is all his work. Jim started working on Spiro-related material in 1960 and has continued to work on it ever since, and has revised his interpretations over time as new evidence has come in. So this is his most recent interpretation. And what he thinks happened is inside the Craig Mound, the large lobe here, there was a platform mound excavated into it, or built into it, and then the Great Mortuary itself was dug down inside this mound and was later capped by this hollow chamber. And I'll talk about these in detail here as we go through it. There's the spirit law directed over part of the Great Mortuary. So what Jim believes, and I think he's probably right, is we have this depression excavated into the platform mound. This is the edge of the platform mound. Here's the depression. And what we have first is the lowest layer of it. We have basically a mass of disarticulated bones and broken artifacts over a bed of cane splints oriented in the same direction. For a while, people thought that these were individuals representing the chief of some sort or special people. Now it's not really thought quite as much because these artifacts, again, they're not intact individuals. The bones are sort of mixed up and jumbled together. And artifacts, rather than being placed in there carefully, seem to have been ritually killed. So copper plates bent in half, things purposely smashed, and all put in this spot. And this is a sort of a pattern we see at a lot of sites related to Spiro, particularly early on in the Harlan phase in the 1200s, is an emphasis on group identity rather than single people in burial. The next level is where we see some of these litter burials. Here you can see drawings of some of the cedar poles with partly disarticulated burials and some burial goods. And we have an entranceway at this time with a large post blocking the center of it. And so we do have burial goods and we do have individuals, but again, they're basically commingled and most of the artifacts have been killed, but there aren't as many as there were in the level before it. And the final level, this is what was believed up until fairly recently to be part of the spirit or the Great Mortuary. But Jim Brown has recently split this area out into what's called the spirit house, or that hollow chamber. And this is where a lot of the artifacts that we think of when we think of Spiro were placed very carefully and very deliberately as basically a map of cosmological importance. So we have the resting warrior, who may be a representation of the red horn figure. He's basically placed in the wall facing out as a guardian. And then we have an earth mother symbolizing fertility. We have lots of baskets and in carefully placed bundles and engraved shell cups, all placed within this area. And the shell cups, this is not something I get into too much today, but this is work that Dr. George Sabo at the University of Arkansas, or the Arkansas Archeological Survey, has done. He has been able to, along with Jim and a couple other researchers, have been able to identify a pattern involving an event that's depicted on a number of these different shell cups. So rather than thinking that this is an area for the elite, we now think this is basically a ritual cosmogram probably not tied to any one person. If you read a lot of the literature in the past, everybody thought that that area was marking the final burial places of elites, possibly chiefs. Now we're a lot less sure of that. So the big question is, why was this thing created? And it's not super easy for us to get at that right now, especially because of the nature of the artifacts, how they've been scattered over the years. A lot of the information that Jim has used to recreate this thing has been based upon some interviews that were done with some of the Pocola Mining Company people, 40, 50 years ago, in which they drew out sketch maps showing where these burial objects were actually placed. But we feel pretty good about the way that stands at this point. But the question of why it was created, and there's a number of different possibilities, but one of the ones that we as Spiro researchers think is plausible is that there was a multi-generational drought at this point in Spiro's history. And so we think that one thing that might have happened is that shamans, priests, or other religious leaders might have realized that the previous pattern of sort of group identity and burial wasn't really working. They wanted to reboot the system and make the rains come again. And so it's very possible that the one reason this was created, the Spirit House, was that it was created as an attempt to lock in the power of all these objects and sort of reboot the system and get the cosmos working the way they were hoping it would, or the way it used to. That doesn't appear to be the case. The drought continues. Sometime around in the early 1400s, Spiro itself is pretty much abandoned, and we see other people living in the area, but they've got much more of a plains lifestyle as opposed to an eastern woodlands lifestyle. This is where we see bison bones and bison scapula hose and things like that coming in that are common on the plains, but not in the Arkansas Valley before this time period. So to sort of summarize Craig Mound here, what we have is what's probably the largest collection of ritual artifacts found in one place in North America. And it may have been a response to that severe drought, an attempt to sort of get the religious system going again. And what it does tell us is a lot about ritual life may have been like, the kind of objects that are in there. All of these objects you can find stories about in Native American ethnographies and get some ideas of what they represented and what characters they were supposed to be, what they brought to the table. But this assemblage doesn't tell us really anything about everyday life. And that's something that our research group is very interested in as part of this whole project. We're very interested in the ritual aspects of things. We're all involved in various studies about iconography and things like that as well. But we want to get back into regular archaeology, so to speak, and get an idea of what might have been happening in other parts of the site. And so in 2011, a number of us from both the University of Oklahoma and the Arkansas Archeological Survey got together to start the Spiro Landscape Archaeological Project, which is aimed at understanding non-mound occupation at Spiro using a variety of different geophysical techniques. And I've sort of listed the ones here that we used with varying success in some cases. I'm mostly just going to talk about the magnetometry today for lack of time. But we used all these other different techniques as well. And then we followed up our geophysical survey with excavation and ground truthing of some of our results. So here's just some examples of what we used. We do have precision mapping. So we have a topo map of the site that's down to a centimeter accuracy. We ran radar on some of the smaller house mounds as well as the brown mound. We've done a little bit of conductivity. We've done gradiometry on pretty much the entire area inside the park boundaries. It's currently owned by the Corps of Engineers, but maintained by the Oklahoma Historical Society as a state park. We've covered everything within the park boundaries and a little bit outside of it with gradiometry because it's the fastest of these techniques. We've also done a large number of grids with electrical resistance. And gradiometry, basically the way it works is that it detects subtle magnetic anomalies in the soil. So there are various cultural processes and natural processes that cause soil to become more highly magnetized. Things like fires and hearths and digging into pits and backfilling them, all that stuff causes contrast in the height of the magnetic degree of the soil compared to the matrix around it. And magnetometry or gradiometry is really good at being able to pick up on those anomalies and point us towards the locations of possible features. So this is the area we've covered on an old aerial photograph, everything inside the red. This area down here at the very bottom of the slide is outside of the park boundaries. This is where the museum is today. So we've done a fair amount. It's something like 850 20 by 20 meter grids. It's a lot. So here's just a sketch basically of the site with the mounds in red and then our geophysical results sort of in these various shades of black and white. And what we're looking at here are the dark areas are areas of higher magnetism, and the white is generally areas of lower magnetism. And there's a fair amount of noise in parts of this data. The area around Craig Mound right here, this is an old meander scar of the Arkansas River that has deposited a much more magnetic soil. So it blocks out a lot of our gradiometry results here. We also have problems where up in this upper terrace area of the site, this area up here is about 3 meters taller than this area in topographic relief. But up in here, there were still people living up until the 70s. So all these patches of all it looks like snow here are basically caused by metal. And so we've been filling in some of these areas with other techniques that aren't susceptible to metal objects. But what's interesting is you should be able to see these patterns of darker, higher magnetism areas in the sort of plaza outside of Craig Mound. And here's sort of just zooming in on the lower terrace area around Craig to show you. This is the area that's outside of the park boundary. Here's the museum, but I've clipped this out a little bit so you can see these things come out a little bit stronger. And there they are in red, so they're a little easier to see what I'm talking about. Now these were sort of intriguing to us because they're obviously they're 3-4 meters across. There are a lot of them. But what's interesting is they're very faint. So when we normally look at cultural features using geophysics, especially gradiometry, we would expect to see readings of somewhere between 6 and 12 nanoteslas. Nanotesla is just the unit of measure we use for gradiometry. Well, these things average 0.8, which is very, very low. And so we ran a number of different technologies over them to make sure that it wasn't just we like to joke, is a figment of the gradiometer's imagination. And the ones we've hit with multiple techniques, they've shown up in every single one, which made us pretty confident that they're actually cultural features. So in 2013 and 14, we got a permit from the Corps of Engineers and permission from the Historical Society, and more importantly, the Caddo Nation and Wichita and affiliated tribes, who are the descendants of the people who lived at Spiro, probably, to excavate 4 of these small anomalies located along a creek that has been channeled through the middle of the site. It used to be in a different location, but sometime in the 40s or 50s, the landowners at the time channeled this out to help with drainage. And it was kind of funny. I was giving a talk about this to Oklahoma Anthropological Society chapter meeting in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and a guy came up and introduced himself to me as Mr. Ward, he of the Ward Mounds, and he and his dad and grandfather were the ones who had actually channeled this out. But we were worried about these 4 in particular because they're being eroded away by that creek. And so the red lines here are just pointing to the areas we were actually excavating. This is another shot that gives you a pretty good feel for how big the Craig Mound actually is. This person right here is Patrick Livingood, who's professor in the anthropology department at OU, and he's 6'7", so that should sort of tie you in a little bit. So we dug 4 of these buildings, and I'm not going to get into too much of it because of the time, but this is where I want to point out to remember back at the beginning where I talked about how regularly spaced and the posts and everything were for normal Spiro houses, what we think are normal, that were dug by the WPA, with the straight walls and the regularly spaced center posts. We don't really have that in any of the 4 buildings that we dug. They're fairly small. They don't have very many artifacts in them. I think we had 160 potsherds from the whole thing, but we do have artifacts that are lying in situ on what we think are the house floors. They're very faint. You know, I mentioned that 8.8 nanotesla reading. That suggests that it wasn't occupied for very long. They're very irregular in shape and very sloppily constructed. You can see the posts are all of different size in these maps. They're not circled. They're not really square. We kind of jokingly call them squircles. The posts aren't really evenly spaced out, and there really aren't any internal hearths or features whatsoever, which suggests to us that they were not used for a very long time period. So one of the things that we've hypothesized is that these are temporary buildings, possibly built for a very short-term event. And one of the things that we want to believe, we don't have the evidence for it yet, is that these might represent really hastily built shelters, kind of like wigwams or something like that, or lean-tos, brought by people coming for a pilgrimage associated with the creation of the Spirit Lodge. Now, I didn't mention this before, but Jim Brown argues that the Spirit Lodge was probably only open for a couple of weeks and then it was sealed up. So maybe a lot of these people were coming here to place their special objects inside the Spirit Mound, like their bundles from their home villages, as a part of this process to sort of reboot the cosmos. We've done some statistical analysis on these that shows that these, I don't have them in this presentation, but it shows that some of these buildings, if you look at nearest neighbor analysis and things like that, are actually, there's clusters of them. They're oriented in rows to roughly the same angle as the Craig Mound. And so we're harboring that as one possibility of what these might be. Unfortunately, we don't have anything datable for them. We did have a charred post from House 22 here and House 21. Then we had them carbon dated and they came back to the 1910s. So they're probably part of the same historic fence that was there at the time. So unfortunately, we don't have anything to date them on yet, nor do we have any diagnostic artifacts that might tie us into that being a definite positive identification. But a lot of the lines of evidence we have point towards that being a possibility. It's at least marking an event of some sort, whether it's the Spirit Lodge event or possibly an event marking the creation of Spiro in general. We can't really say, but that's one of our sort of working hypotheses we have going on right now. And we have ongoing excavations that are aimed at solving some of these questions. I'm supposed to be in towards the tail end of week 2 of a 5-week project at Spiro right now, but due to the pandemic, here I am. So hopefully the next summer or the summer after, when all this blows over, we'll be able to sort of get back into it and explore more of this and see if we're on the right pace. Sort of to wrap things up, I want to make sure that I thank the people who have made this possible. First, I'm the one giving this talk, but again, a number of there's 7 of us involved in the research team, all as equals. And that would be Amanda Rainier and Patrick Livingood from OU, and George Sabo, John Samuelson, Tim Mulvihill, and Jamie Lockhart from the Arkansas Archaeological Survey. Dennis Peterson is the site director at Spiro, and he'll be the one you see if you ever visit. He was great in the logistical stuff. Again, the Core and the Caddo Nation and the Wichita tribes were great in being supportive and actually coming and visiting us. Our respective surveys provided some money, as did the Arts and Sciences, College of Arts and Sciences here at OU. And we had a number of student volunteers and field school students who moved a lot of dirt for us. So thank you to all of them, and thank you to you for listening to me talk today.
This was really great. Really appreciate. I'm sad you can't be out at the site right now, but I'm glad we got to take advantage of your time. On the mortuary site, with the bones of the different individuals, has there ever been any work to determine how many individuals and what were the ages, causes of death, or those type of details?
It's really difficult because we don't have all the information we would need. A lot of that stuff, again, it's just so splintered up. To the best of my knowledge, nobody has. Some people have looked at some of the skeletons, the more intact skeletons, for stuff like diet, but to the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been any large-scale studies of any of those. No.
Well, very interesting. And can you tell more information for our members if they're interested in visiting the site?
So if you go, the museum is open, I believe, Tuesday through Sunday with short hours on Sunday. You can go to okhistory.org and you can find the operating hours there. Right now, I believe the museum is closed until sometime in early June. If you can go there and you can walk around the site and look at the mounds, but you can't get into the museum yet. And so they have in the museum, there's basically a reconstructed building in there. Most of the artifacts are replicas. They're really well done replicas, but most of them are replicas. One of the big collections on display from Spiro is here at OU at the Sam Noble Museum of Natural History. But the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa also has some, as well as the Woolarock Museum in Bartlesville.
Well, very good. Hey, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And we'll sign off here.